Welcome, everybody, and so happy to see so many in the audience tonight. My name is Jim Basker, and I'm the president of the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History. And I want to extend a special welcome to all the teachers and students in our audience. I'm told that there are something like 2,600 people with us tonight, which is a tribute to our great friend, Skip Gates. Tonight, we have a very special program for you. It's a conversation with Henry Louis Gates, Jr., about his latest book of many, The Black Church. This is our story. This is our song. But before turning to it, I'd like to say a few words about the Gilder Lehrman Institute. Founded in 1994 by Richard Gilder and Louis Lehrman, it is dedicated to the teaching, to improving the teaching and learning of American history, not only in the K-12 population, but across the whole general public. We've grown very significantly over the last 25 years. We have a network now of 29,000 schools growing every year, representing 56,000 teachers, and through them, something like 7.5 or 7.8 million children in their classrooms every year. 3.5 million unique visitors check out our website every year and use its resources. And one of our major programs, the Hamilton Education Program Online, has 5,000 teachers registered, serving almost 400,000 students every semester. One of our latest initiatives we're very proud of, it's called Black Lives in the Founding Era, and it's across many genres, but it has resulted in an important booklet about slavery and abolition in the founding era, which has been sent to some 6,000 K-12 schools. There are teachers enrolled this summer in 2 of our teacher seminars that are dedicated to topics connected with Black lives in the founding era. And a special issue of our online journal, History Now, came out a couple of weeks ago, which reached 7,000 subscribers, entirely dedicated to the topic, Black lives in the founding era. I encourage you all to check out those resources, and especially if you're teachers, turn to us for all those materials and more. I mentioned the Institute being around for 25 years plus, and I want to say that Henry Louis Gates, Skip Gates to his friends, has been with us from the beginning. He served on the Scholarly Advisory Board from the moment of our founding. He's done innumerable programs with us for teachers, for students, when there were book launches and films and all kinds of projects. And of course, recently he's become a trustee of the Institute and one of our guiding voices. He's always been there for the teachers and students in the Gilder Lehrman network. But I want to say a special word here about the relationship between Skip Gates and our late co-founder, Dick Gilder, whom we lost just a year ago in May, just short of his 88th birthday. From the beginning, and I witnessed this personally, Dick Gilder and Skip Gates had a very special relationship. Maybe that was because they were both Yaleys, maybe because both of them were deeply committed to African-American history and to the recovery and dissemination of that history. But there was also a very special kinship between them that one could sense. They were both men who loved big ideas, who pursued transformative projects, and who were entrepreneurial above all. And they just loved each other's company. You could see it every time I ever saw them together. Dick would have loved to be here tonight to listen to this program, and he would have been grateful to Skip for sharing his time and his knowledge with all of our teachers and students, giving them a chance to experience one of the shining stars of the American intellectual and cultural universe. To say more about our guests and to lead the conversation, I turn now to another friend, the Reverend Phil Jackson, who's the priest in charge and vicar at Trinity Church, Wall Street. He's a very good friend to the Gilder Lehrman Institute. He serves on our President's Council. He's also a man who loves history and shares history, and he's going to lead the conversation with Professor Henry Louis Gates tonight. Over to you, Phil.
Well, thank you, Jim, and thank everyone for being on with us today. It is my great pleasure as a college history major and a lover of history and reading history to welcome our guest today, Skip Gates. I wanted to call him Professor Gates. He wouldn't let me. He had a threat because he is the historian's historian. And just such an honor for me, brother, to be on with you today and to lead you through a discussion around your new book, The Black Church, This Is Our Story, This Is Our Song. Little background on Professor Gates. He's the Alphonse Fletcher University professor and director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard. He's obviously, we all know, he's an Emmy award-winning filmmaker, Peabody Award winner. He has done so much to get history, and particularly the history of African American people in this country and in this world, out to the public. He is the man. And I could not be happier than to talk to you specifically and especially about this subject and this book. I'd like to, Skip, if it's okay, I'd like to start with looking at history. And I'd like you to look at it from what I thought was a lens in your book that I had never really seen before. I'd like to ask you to look at it, which is, could you look at the history for us of the Black church through the lens of Mother Emanuel Church?
Oh, I'd be happy to. I think, Phil, we're going to show a clip from the series, aren't we?
Oh, yes, we are. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yes, we are. Let's get the clip first.
Okay, and then we'll go to Mother Emanuel. I love this story.
This is our story. Oh, this is our song. Praising my Savior. Oh, all the day long. All the day long. All the day long.
Ah, that is great.
In the name of Jesus today, oh God, we are rising.
The Black church was more than just a spiritual home. It was the epicenter of Black life. Out of it came our Black businesses, our Black educational institutions.
The Black church gave people a sense of value, belonging, and worthiness. I don't know how we could have survived as a people without it.
To tell the story of American religion is to tell a political story.
The Black church helped us to withstand all the slings and arrows of segregation and the segregationists.
We're willing to be beaten for democracy. Freedom!
Who are the 5 greatest Black preachers of all time? There's so many.
Prathia Hall.
Renita Weems.
We serve a Jesus who came and turned over the tables.
Jeremiah Wright.
Gardner Taylor.
Gardner Taylor.
Howard Thurman.
I left out Otis Moss.
Presiding Bishop Michael Curry.
Love can be sacrificial.
Did you think that you were going to get one amen out of those Brits?
I learned how to see amens in their eyes.
I'ma clap my hands. I'ma sing to the Lord.
Some might argue that the Black church is the first Black theater. The role of music in the Black church is everything. How do you define gospel music?
Oh, really simple. Gospel music is the sonic presentation that talks about the majesty of Jesus.
Entertainment shouldn't be in the church. What do you think the preacher does? The preacher, and there, and if what? That's entertainment.
The African American church is 80 to 90% women, but the leadership is 80 to 90% male.
There's an awful price to pay when you say that you're a same-gender loving person.
If you say you were born this way, then you're saying, God, you're a liar.
We are a testament to the goodness and the grace of God. Everything in the world has tried to kill us, and we're still here.
Culture says you the wrong race. The price says I made your race, and I ain't made no mistake.
It was our balm in Gilead, the place where our people made a way out of no way. It was that place from which our souls could look back and wonder how we got over. We call it the church.
That's let me just say to any of our listeners and watchers today that if you have not seen that series, you need to see that series. And in tandem with the book, it just is so powerful, Skip. Just
thank you.
So sorry to get ahead of myself. I can't wait to start talking to you. But, so what I was thinking is, this idea of looking at the history of the Black church through Mother Emanuel, asking you to look backwards from 1816 and then forward to 2015. There's a lot going on there that you, I think, just beautifully bring out in the book.
Thank you. Yeah, that was one of the leitmotifs in the book. And if I forget, I want you to ask me about the three Black AME preachers. I built a triangle around them: Richard Harvey Kane, Daniel Payne, and Henry McNeil Turner too. But Mother Emanuel, let's go to Charleston, South Carolina. South Carolina was majority Black state. South Carolina, Louisiana, Mississippi were majority Black states. And ground zero for the Black community during Reconstruction was Charleston, South Carolina. And Georgia, Alabama, and Florida were almost majority Black states. So there's a real concentration of Black power, as Representative Clyburn says to me in the film, in those 6 southern states. And that was true even before the Civil War. South Carolina's nickname was Negro country because it was so full of Black people. And that, of course, was because of the economy and the productivity of rice in the Sea Islands and the expertise of Africans brought to South Carolina to go grow rice. But there was also a sizable free Black community. Now, we know that the AME Church is the first Black denomination, and it's formed in Philadelphia by Richard Allen. And it's formally born in the year 1860. Well, in Charleston, there is Emmanuel Church. And in 1822, a man named Denmark Vesey, as you know, was accused of plotting an insurrection in Charleston. Denmark Vesey was free. How did he get free? He got free. I want the students to listen to this because this is one of the ironies of American history and the complexity of slavery. He was an enslaved man in 1799. He played the city lottery, like you play at the grocery store, a convenience store, and he won $1,500. And he used 600 of those $1,500 to buy his own freedom from his so-called owners, whose surname was Vesey. And so after 1800, he was free. And in 1822, he was a very prominent man. He was accused, we don't know if it was really an insurrection that was being plotted, but he was accused of leading this plot for an insurrection in Charleston. And he was found guilty, and of course he was executed. The church was completely destroyed. Now, there was enormous sensitivity is not even the right word. There was paranoia among the slave owners because the Haitians had defeated the greatest army on earth, the army of Napoleon Bonaparte. When Napoleon became emperor, he wanted to reinstitute slavery on the island of Saint-Domingue, the name of Haiti before it became free.
And a particularly brutal form of slavery.
Oh, it was horrible. The average lifespan on a sugar plantation was 7 years. 7 years. Saint-Domingue was the richest colony in the history of the world. And because of sugar was like crack. I've never done crack. Students, forgive me for their teachers, forgive me for using that analogy. But normal people, students, couldn't afford sugar. Sugar was a luxury product. Kings and queens and bishops too, as the song says. Only wealthy people could use sugar before the New World opened up. And so sugar could be mass produced and become one of the world's first commodity products. And it was also used to bolster the working class to give them more energy so they could be exploited. And some anti-slavery figures in England boycotted sugar because they knew it was a product with blood, dripping all over it. So the Haitians defeated Napoleon when Napoleon sent his brother-in-law Leclerc back in 1801 to try to reinstitute slavery, which had been abolished in 1794, and then under the French Assembly. And you know those details. They tricked Toussaint Louverture. He died in a horrible death in a prison in France, but Jean-Jacques Dessalines led the Haitians to freedom. So the Americans were paranoid about slave insurrections. And so whether or not Denmark Vesey was plotting, he was found guilty, he was executed. They destroyed the church. So cut to the end of the Civil War, and there were all these Black people in South Carolina. And Richard Harvey Kane was an AME minister in Brooklyn. Basically, he faxed himself to Charleston because the AME church hadn't been allowed to proselytize in the Confederacy. And 90% of all Black people as late as 1910 lived in the former Confederate states, lived in the former, in the South before the Great Migration. So they knew that that was fertile grounds for growth. And so ground zero had to be Charleston. And the first thing that Richard Harvey Kane does is rebuild Mother Emanuel Church. And who does he hire as the architect to build it? Denmark Vesey's son. Denmark Vesey's son. You can't make that up. It was like poetry. It was a gift of God. So Richard Harvey Kane becomes a major figure in the Renaissance. He's in Reconstruction. He starts his own newspaper, and then he will run for Congress and be elected in 1872 and 1876. So the third beat in this story, sadly, is Dylann Roof. And Dylann Roof did not choose Mother Emanuel accidentally.
By accident, was it?
No, because it was the heart of Reconstruction. And he, and I did the last interview, we believe, with Reverend Clementa Pinckney and that Wednesday night, he was at prayer meeting and with 8 other, I call them the saints.
The saints.
The innocents.
Yeah.
And Dylann Roof prayed with them ostensibly for an hour. And then, as we know, he murdered 9 people that night in Mother Emanuel. So that completes the arc of Mother Emanuel Church. But it was the heart of Reconstruction. And Black men, we tend to forget this, but Black men in the former Confederacy got the right to vote because of the Reconstruction Act 3 years before the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. Black men in the South got the right to vote in the summer of 1867. So they registered to vote. 80% of the Black men eligible to vote in the South registered to vote in the summer of 1867. I call it the first freedom summer.
Right.
And Phil, in 1868, they voted. 500,000 Black men cast their ballots, we have to presume, for the Republican Party for Ulysses S. Grant. Now, Grant won the Electoral College overwhelmingly, but he only won the popular vote by just over 300,000 votes. So you could say, and Black people said, they had elected a president of the United States through the popular vote. And as Clavering said, the most important point for Reconstruction, the manifestation of power through the ballot was Charleston, South Carolina. In that first election, Reconstruction election, the House of Representatives was majority Black, the Speaker of the House was Black, the Secretary of State was Black, the Secretary of Treasury was Black. It was amazing. And in the racist film, probably the most racist film ever made, Birth of a Nation, we tend to think that it was about slavery, but it wasn't. It was about Reconstruction, the evil of Reconstruction and the evil of giving Black men the right to vote. You remember that famous scene where Black men are in the legislature.
The legislature just falling out, right?
With their feet up and eating chicken bones, you know, sucking on chicken bones and drinking liquor. Right. And they all jump up and cheer, and the caption, because it's a silent film, says, miscegenation made legal, you know, the right. It was terrible, man. It was terrible. It was horrible. So thank you for asking that question. And you can see the power of the church in politics. And often Christianity, especially, has been accused. Well, Karl Marx accused religion of being the opiate of the people, famously. And as I write in the book, people forget the rest of.
There was more to it. There was more to that quote, wasn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. But for African-American Christians, they never were allowed to be apolitical, because the Black church, starting with the AME church, was born in politics, born as a protest against anti-Black racism, because Richard Allen and Absalom Jones were attending St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia, an integrated church. They had to sit in the back, in the Jim Crow section, in effect, before the invention of Jim Crow. And Absalom Jones is praying in one of the white pews, and some usher comes and tries to tells him to move to the Black section. He goes, "Later for you." They get up and walk out, and they form their own church. Absalom Jones forms the first Black Episcopal Church, St. Thomas, and Richard Allen forms the AME Church, Bethel Church, and then becomes its own denomination in 1816, and he becomes its first bishop.
I was gonna point out humbly that Absalom Jones wasn't Episcopalian, so I just wanted to just wanted to get that out there.
Listen, the Gateses have been Episcopalians as long as they've been Christians. So
that's what I saw in the book. Yeah,
yeah. It's St. Philip's Episcopal Church in Cumberland, Maryland. All the Gateses are from Cumberland, Maryland. And you know what? And all the Colemans, my mother's family, they were Methodists in Piedmont, West Virginia, 25 miles away. Do you know why so many Black Episcopal churches are called St. Philip's?
Philip the Ethiopian?
Yeah, when Philip the Evangelist meets the Ethiopian eunuch, who is representing the Queen of Meroe.
Right.
She was a real queen, and her title was the Kandake. And he was the eunuch, he was the treasurer, and he is there, runs in, he's reading the book of Isaiah, and runs into Philip the Evangelist. So since there's no other Black figure in the New Testament, the Black Episcopalians seized on this this poor Ethiopian eunuch. And so if you see that there's a St. Philip's Episcopal Church, it used to be a Black Episcopal Church.
Our other big one is St. Cyprian. Usually.
Yes, that's true.
Is also one of.
Yeah, he helped Jesus with the cross, right?
That was Simon of Cyrene.
Oh, that's right, Simon of Cyrene.
Sometimes we get that. Any of the North Africans.
Oh,
we sort of claim them.
Yeah, yeah, that's true.
So let's stay with politics and the quest for social justice. You write in the book. Let me just read this one little kind of bit from page 193. You're writing about the wake of George Floyd. In the wake of George Floyd, you say, in these shattering times, with a rising generation demanding that their voices be heard, that the dehumanization of Black bodies end, that this be the last lynching, the Black church once again has been challenged to respond with leadership and grace, resiliency, and inspired action. That's beautiful writing.
Thank you.
Phil, talk about the church and social justice movements over time.
Well, one of the points that I wanted to make was how political the Black church had been from the very beginning. Frederick Douglass is thought to have risen ostensibly spontaneously on Nantucket Island at a meeting of the Anti-Slavery Society in 1841, but it's just not true. Douglass had been speaking at the AME Church in New Bedford between 1838 and 1841. So he had been, and he taught Sunday school in Baltimore. So he had been practicing his oratory already in the Black church, and he was very religious, of course. His rival, Henry Highland Garnett, they get in a big battle at the National Negro Convention of 1843 about tactics, about whether they should encourage the enslaved people in the South to rebel. Henry Highland Garnett is a Presbyterian minister, and both of them, of course, are leading abolitionists. And then Richard Harvey Kane, I've given him as an example. Of the 16 black men elected to Congress between 1870 and 1877, when Reconstruction ends, 3 were ministers. And Eric Foner, my friend and the world's expert on Reconstruction, says that 2,000 black men were either elected or appointed to office during Reconstruction, and 243 of them were ministers.
Wow.
In 40 Acres and a Mule, where did that come from? General Sherman in Savannah meets with 20 black ministers under the leadership of the mighty Garrison Frazier. And he says, what do you people want? And this is after Sherman's march to the sea. What do you people want? And they said, well, Garrison, and they had a stenographer there. The whole transcript's printed the next day in the newspaper. And Garrison Frazier said, we want land. We want to be left alone, because they understood that land was how you accumulated wealth and transmitted wealth. And they understood the importance of property because we were property. Right. Our ancestors were property. So they had an intuitive understanding of the importance of property. And Sherman issues a couple days later his special field order number 15, reallocating confiscated land of the enslavers to the enslaved. And that was the birth of 40 Acres and a Mule. And that radical land redistribution proposition came out of a meeting with those 20 black ministers. Cut to the 20th century, the face of the civil rights movement in the North, one of them certainly was Adam Clayton Powell Jr., just like his father, the pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church with its 12,000 members.
Right.
And then, of course, the face of the civil rights movement in the South after 1955 would be Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Jesse Jackson, the first black man probably who had at least a chance of winning.
A serious run, right?
Yeah, Jesse, of course, is a minister. Andy Young, Dr. King's lieutenant and mayor of Atlanta, was a minister. And we could take it up to January 5th, the election of Senator Ralph Warnock,
right,
who has Ebenezer Baptist Church. I mean, he is the minister at Ebenezer Baptist Church. So that because of the fight against anti-Black racism and white supremacy was unrelenting, Black Christians, by and large, could not avoid being political. So that our ancestors developed a form of Christianity with the liberating God, Phil, at its center. And that liberation was both after one's death, the liberation of the soul, but liberation on earth. It was, and Black Christianity was meant to be a redemptive force for a nation whose original sin was slavery. That gives it a completely different identity than its sister denominations, whether it was the Methodist Church or the Baptist Church. Anglicans, I'm ashamed to say, were kind of slow in accepting the baptism of Black people, as you well know. In 1680, Morgan Godwin, I always give a lecture about Morgan Godwin, who was an Anglican priest, wrote a book called The Negro and Indians Advocate, in which he says, these people are human beings. There was a question, students, of whether Africans were real human beings or not. I know it sounds hyperbolic, but it's true.
It's true.
And he said, I know they're human beings because they can read and write, and Phil, because of risibility, which means because they can laugh. And only human beings can read, write, and laugh. And he says, and he's refuting the idea that other Anglicans had, that if you baptize these people, they will demand their freedom. He says, no, we don't have to give them their freedom. Servants obey their masters, but we are duty bound by God to save their souls, so that we can keep them enslaved, baptize them, and they will get their freedom and their salvation in heaven. But what most of us don't know, and students, this is very important to remember, is that the Great Awakening unfolds, and that's the big Protestant, it's almost like the American Protestant Reformation. And that unfolds about 1740, 1750. And 59% of our enslaved African ancestors arrived in the United States after 1750. So, and we tend to forget that. So the Methodists and the Baptists welcome Black people with open arms. And this is long before the formation of the National Baptist Convention in 1895 and the Church of God in Christ between 1895 and 1897, both of which caught fire within the Black community. But white Protestant denominations welcomed the Methodists, and the Baptists started welcoming African people into the church in the Great Awakening around 1750, and thereafter till the until eventually the Methodist Church, for example, would split into the Northern Methodist Church and Southern Methodist Church over the issue of slavery, whether it was moral and the question of abolition. And I find that fascinating. When I wrote that line, about the last lynching, I thought that maybe, just maybe, I mean, hope against hope, that maybe George Floyd would be the last person murdered unjustly by the police, but we know that that's not the way that it has turned out.
Right, sadly. Let me take you back to something that you were talking about, the meeting with Sherman. You write very powerfully in the book also about another famous meeting with Black ministers, which is the meeting with Lincoln.
Yes.
For the issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, it's August 1862, and Abraham Lincoln sends a man who was in favor of the relocation of freed Black people out of the United States, either to Panama, to Mexico, to Haiti, or back to Africa. And he gathers 5 Black men who were ministers to come to the White House. And he says that he wants them to be the leaders of the movement to basically deport all the free Black people, to lead them out of here. He says, your people and our people never gonna like each other. They're gonna be enemies. It's your fault that that we're in the middle of this Civil War, because remember, this is August 1862. And there's no report.
The North is losing at that point.
Yeah, the North is losing big time. And he said, and Lincoln obviously knew that he was going to have to free these Black people. And whether it was, I was reading Eric Foner again the other day, and Foner said, until the end of 1862, Lincoln still it was entertained until through November. Lincoln was still entertaining notions of colonization, that you could remove these people, that their presence, like Thomas Jefferson had said in Notes on the State of Virginia, their presence with white people was incompatible. And
I hate to interrupt you. That Notes on the State of Virginia, that's a piece of work.
Man, it's bad. He even says that orangutans in Africa mate with African women. You can't get more racist than that. Whoa. Remember, we were telling the students about Morgan Godwin, who had to make the case that Africans were human beings, were members of the human community. Thomas Jefferson puts that in there. Yeah. He doesn't say it as directly as Morgan Godwin is refuting, right? But he says that we all know that orangutans prefer African women, meaning that, whoa, are they at the top of the animal kingdom on the great chain of being, or at the bottom of the human family on the great chain of being? And that's why reading and writing was important. That's why everybody reviewed Phyllis Wheatley's book.
Yeah.
Because she was the first person of African descent to publish a book of poetry in English, and everybody wrote about that. Benjamin Franklin visited her when they were both in London. She had to go to London to get her book published because nobody in Boston believed that an African was smart enough to write a book by herself. Voltaire wrote a friend a letter saying, wow, I guess they can write poetry, which he, and George Washington, during the middle of the Revolution, has her brought to his headquarters, my house. I'm in my kitchen, ladies and gentlemen, in Harvard Square, Washington's headquarters were about a block and a half away on Brattle Street. He had Phyllis Wheatley brought to his headquarters just so he could see an African who had written a book of
to see this new thing, right?
Yeah, to see this phenomenon, this like talking animal, in effect. So I'm sorry, I lost our train.
Back to were you talking about Lincoln's meeting?
Oh yeah. So then news of this, of course, hits the Black community. Frederick Douglass goes nuts. Because Douglass had said no. One of his arguments with Henry Highland Garnett was, no, this is our home. We are not Africans anymore. We're not going to Liberia. We're not going to Sierra Leone, which had been set up for freed Africans either captured by the British on ships after the slave trade was banned, the slave trade to the British colonies banned in 1807 and to the United States in 1808. And Liberia, of course, which was set up by the American Colonization Society in 1826 for freed African Americans to quote unquote go back. Yeah, it wasn't even go back. They weren't from Liberia, and they, by and large, there were very few of our ancestors who were from what is now Liberia. About 25% of our ancestors we know because of David Altus and David Richardson's amazing database, which you could look up right now on the internet. It's called voyages.org now, or you could look it up under the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database. About 25% of our ancestors came from Senegambia, which was heavily Muslim, and about 25% came from Congo, Angola. And one of the amazing things, two amazing facts that I learned, Phil, when we were making the film and when I was writing this book, was that about 20%, now historians argue about this percentage. Mm-hmm. I settled on 20%, and that's a figure given by John Thornton and Linda Haywood at BU, or great friends of Gilder Lehrman and great friends of mine and Jim Basker. About 20% of our enslaved ancestors were practicing Muslims when they got on the boat.
I did not know that till I read the book.
Yeah, yes. We featured the story. I tell the story in the book of Joe Ben Solomon and Bilali Muhammad, and in the film of Bilali Muhammad, and I interview one of his descendants, and he left behind a manuscript in Arabic, instructions on how to find Mecca, how to pray to the east. And the first Black churches, there are about 4 churches that argue about which one was the first Black church. But we filmed in the first African Baptist church in Savannah, and that was formed in 1773. And there's this great scene in the film where we flew down a linguist from Harvard to interpret some script that's engraved carved into one of the pews. And he looks at it and says, "It's Arabic."
Oh, that's Arabic.
And there's a sister in the kitchen. I can hear yelling, saying, "It's cursive Hebrew. It's cursive Hebrew. It can't be Arabic." But 20% of our ancestors were Muslim, practicing Muslims when they landed in what is now the United States, and a percent that we don't know had also been baptized Roman Catholics, because the King of Congo converted to Roman Catholicism in the year 1491. And he 1491, a year before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right?
Wow.
And he converted his kingdom, and he sent his son. He was no dummy, he understood power. He sent his son to be trained as a priest, and he became the first bishop. He came back to the Kingdom of Congo, I think in 1517, and became the first bishop. Islam reached West Africa by the 10th century. And we know from an historian called Alec Idrisi that by the 12th century, Islam was widely practiced in what's now Senegal and Gambia. So there's absolutely no question about the fact that yeah. And so you can think of the first century of Black people enslaved in British North America as traditional African religion, ancestral worship, Yoruba religion, of course, was a very powerful force, more particularly in Cuba with Santeria and in Brazil with Candomblé.
Yeah.
But about 3% of our ancestors were Yoruba. So you have 20% who were Islamic. We have an unknown percentage who were baptized Roman Catholics. And then the majority, of course, were practiced ancestral, traditional African religion. So think of it as a kind of stew. That because the Anglicans, who were dominant, are not letting Africans join, right? And Africans are surreptitiously hearing Christianity, worshiping their own gods, forming a kind of blend, a melded sort of religion. Then the Anglicans open up, and then the Great Awakening with the Methodists and the Baptists really welcomes Black people in. My uncle is a Methodist minister. He was trained at BU like Martin Luther King. And I remember that he told me when James Cone's Black Theology came out, that he was a minister. His church was in Indianapolis. Okay. And we happened to be home in Piedmont, West Virginia at the same time. And he said, Black Christianity is different than white Christianity. And I wasn't into studying about the Black church at that time. I'd been raised in the church, as you know from the book. I was saved when I was 12, and then I converted when I was 14 to my father's church, the Episcopal Church, much to his relief, because he thought the Episcopal Church is the true church. But I joined a very conservative Methodist church, and I had to. When you joined the church, you couldn't play cards, you couldn't dance, you couldn't listen to rock and roll. And I love to dance. I love to sing. I had to forswear all of that. I couldn't go to movies. I was a movie junkie. And I joined the choir, and I read the Bible, which stood me in good stead for the SATs and teaching African-American literature, because the silent second text of African-American literature from Phyllis Wheatley through Toni Morrison is the King James Bible.
Right, you better know it. Right.
Bible.
Right.
Without Song of Solomon, my goodness, and Beloved. And I did that as I said, because as you know, because my mother was very sick, and she told me one Sunday night, I looked up and my parents were all dressed, and they were taking my mother to the hospital, and she bent over and she cried and told me she was going to die. And I couldn't believe it. I was, I'm so close to my mother. And I went upstairs to my bedroom, and I got on my knees and I cried and I prayed and I prayed, and I just begged Jesus, if you let my mother live, I'll give my soul to you, Lord. And 3 days later, Phil, my mother came home from the hospital. She did that. And I looked in the mirror and I said, uh-oh. And
now what?
The following Saturday, I hitchhiked. There were so few Black people in Eastern West Virginia. I grew up halfway between Pittsburgh and Washington, in the Allegheny Mountains on the Potomac River. My family's lived there for 200 years. Wow. On all branches of my family. You don't think of that as a hotbed of African-American culture, Appalachia, but that's where my people were from. And we had one minister for two churches, one in the county seat 5 miles away, Kaiser, West Virginia. They would have their service on Saturday afternoon, and then Sunday morning service was in Piedmont. And so Saturday afternoon, I hitchhiked. I didn't even think about, being hurt or anything. That's how innocent life was then. And I hitchhiked 5 miles to Kaiser, and I go to the service, and there were about 15 Black people. The average age filled must have been about 80.
And you.
And me. And the minister, Reverend Ralph Monroe, Ralph Edel Monroe, at one point in the service said, anybody who wants to give their life to Christ, it's the call to the altar, it's called. And I stood up, Phil, and he said to me, Skippy, the bathroom is back there. They thought I had to go to the bathroom. And I go, no, I want to join the church. People went, what? And they all stood up and they gathered around. It was very moving. And, and he asked me, will you, there were 5 questions, I think. And I said, yes, I do. Or, I answered in the affirmative, and everyone cried and hugged me, and I cried. And then I hitchhiked back home, and it was Saturday night, and we were, those days there were 3 channels, CBS, ABC, and NBC. So we were watching Gunsmoke or whatever it was. And about 9 o'clock, 8:30, 9 o'clock, I decided, I was looking at my mother and father and my brother, who was 5 years older, Dr. Paul Gates. Now he was the chief of dentistry at Bronx Lebanon Hospital.
Okay.
And I said, well, I guess I better tell him. And I go, well, anything new happened to you guys today? They go, why? I go, well, I joined the church. They go, what? You did what? I couldn't believe it. And I never told them why. I never, ever told them why. They never figured out why I joined the church. And the reason that I switched to my father's church when I was 14 was because the people I was worshiping with, they were really good people. Miss Sarah Russell, who would do a kind of little a mini holy dance.
Right.
My grandmother, Big Mom, who was very, very religious. They were very strict. They were fundamentalists. And, you know, they believed the world was created in 7 days. There was a person called Adam and Eve, and we were all descended from them. They believed, they were literalists. They read the Bible literally. And I had the same mind then that I have now. It was just, I was 14 years old. So allegory and, you know, I knew about evolution and that the world hadn't been created in 7 days.
Right.
And I didn't want to be a hypocrite. And so my brother came home from dental school and he said, we've had enough of this. And he said, I'm taking you to see a movie. And it was Saturday afternoon, a matinee. And I thought I was going to, it was a Beatle movie. I think it was either Hard Day's Night or Help or whatever, 1964, whatever movie came out. And I enjoyed it so much. When I came out, Phil, I thought a bolt of lightning was going to come out of the sky and strike me dead, man, because I had committed this sin. And I then decided to convert to the Episcopal Church because it was much more liberal and it fit my growing intellect. And it was the right thing for me to do. But those 2 years that I spent in that fundamental, I did the best I could, you know, and it was good discipline. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about spirituality and learned a lot about myself. People often ask me, why did we make this film? And why did I write this book now? And in a way, it was because I wanted to pay tribute to that era, to the tradition. You know, the Black church is the oldest, the most continuous, and the most important institution created in the history of the African-American people.
Yeah.
And think about it. It is the thing, as you saw in the clip when Oprah says, what would we have done without the church? The church kept us sane. The church kept us from going crazy. We learned to defer gratification. And I'm not talking about just deferring gratification from one generation. The last Africans arrived legally in the United States in 1807, right?
Right.
And we weren't freed as a people until the ratification of the 13th Amendment on December 6, 1865. So all those generations of our ancestors had to believe that little Phil Jackson and little Skippy Gates would one day
be
free, educated, and be talking to each other in some medium that they couldn't even imagine. And they were probably sitting around the fire laughing and slapping five and said, yeah, my great-great-grandson is going to go to Harvard, you know. And they go, you crazy, boy, you crazy.
Right.
And they're going to be an African who marries a white American and their son's going to be president of the United States. And they said, that's too much. That's just too much. You all been drinking too much of that pot liquor. But our people believe, they've had to believe in the future. Yes. And they learned to believe in the future through the church. And the other thing that I realized was that the church was a laboratory for the formation both of the African people genetically, because remember, we represented about 50 ethnic groups, right, from Senegal down to Congo, Angola, and then to Mozambique and then to Madagascar, but overwhelmingly between Senegal and the Congo. And it was a laboratory for the production of Black culture, for Black music. Mm-hmm. You know, one of the greatest, when Dvorak, the Czech composer, came to the United States, 1892, 1893, writes an essay, and he said, the only original American contribution to world civilization was the music of the former slaves, the spiritual, which Du Bois called the sorrow songs. And I haven't announced it yet, but the next series that we're doing is about other Black social networks, the way that we replicated the world behind the veil, as Du Bois called it. And, you know, like the Black Masons.
Fraternities, sororities.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the Divine Nine, you know, which Vice President Kamala Harris is a member of the Alpha Kappa Alphas, Howard University. But also the National Medical Association, National
Bar Association.
National Bar Association, all those Black institutions which modeled their existence on the denominations of the Black church. But Phil, after that, I'm going to do the history of gospel music.
Okay, you know, okay, so they're gonna get mad at me because I'm supposed to do Q&A now. But that's the one thing I wanted to, I had on to talk to you about, but I wanted to talk to you about Black music. But let's go to Q&A, but I want to ask you, I'm going to close by asking you to tell me like your favorite gospel song. But we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that.
Okay.
Here's
you can ask me. You can ask me now, or well, I'm the guest, so you do whatever you want. You ask me.
Well, so me too. Okay, let me ask this question. What did the Great Migration mean to the racial makeup of the United States and Northern Black churches?
Oh, that's a great question. We remember I said that in 1910, 90% of the African-American people lived in the South. And after 1910, of course, Black people began to migrate to the North. The majority of Black people never, ever lived in the North. And reverse migration starts in 1970, but it came very close. The percentage, it became more or less balanced, like 60-40. I think you can fact check me. I can't remember. I don't have the stats at hand. But 1970, Black people started moving back to the South, in part because of air conditioning. You know.
No, really. No, really. That's fair. Yes.
Yeah, and the disappearance of industrial jobs from the urban North, which had drawn them to the North in the first place during World War I. So it meant that it meant two things, two results: that large Black denominations formed in the city, in the northern cities, right? Because 90% of Black people had been in the South,
right?
And when they moved to the North, they took their church
with them. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing is that the last Reconstruction congressman leaves the House of Representatives in 1901, and he gives a beautiful speech. He says, "The Negro will rise again like a phoenix." The next Black man who's elected to Congress is Oscar DePriest from Chicago in 1929. Why? Because Black people had moved from Mississippi and Alabama to Chicago.
Yeah.
And they were concentrated on the South Side, and they had the right to vote. Why? Because of the 15th ratification of the 15th Amendment.
And they had the numbers.
They had the numbers.
Yep.
And so, and they had been disenfranchised, starting with the Mississippi Plan in 1890, from each of the former Confederate states. And I'll give you an example of how effective it was. They had been disenfranchised through state constitutions that were just amounted to total voter repression for Black people, through poll taxes and literacy tests that only my colleague at the Harvard Law School, Lawrence Tribe, could ever pass, right? And I'll tell you how dramatic it was, and I want the students to hear this. In Louisiana, remember, it's one of the majority Black states when the Civil War ended. In 1890, in 1898, there were 130,000 Black men registered to vote. By 1904, after the ratification of the new Louisiana state constitution, there were 1,342 Black men registered to vote. In effect, 3, you know?
Yeah.
That's amazing. From 130,000 in 6 years, from 130,000, 1,342. So the North was the site of the growth of the Black church and the growth of Black political power, which is why Congressman John Lewis, another ordained minister, was beaten on Pettus Bridge. What were they marching for? Voting rights, because that was the heart of Black power. The movie that Birth of a Nation, the movie Birth of a Nation is based on the novel by Thomas Dixon called The Klansman. And in it, he says, the worst thing that ever happened in the history of civilization was not the defeat of the South by the North. It was giving the formerly enslaved the right to vote. It was the reversal of all that was beautiful and true in the history of civilization from the Greeks. It is an amazing passage, man.
Right.
And he said that was the betrayal. That was the upturning of civilization and by these unscrupulous people in the north and scallywags in the south.
It would almost be hard to believe if it weren't happening now.
Yes, and that's why I made the series before this, Sony the Road, on Reconstruction, because I wanted people to realize that what's happening now is a repeat of the rollback to Reconstruction. Reconstruction is that period between 1865 and 1877 where Black people experienced a maximum amount of freedom because of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. And it was all rolled back by the period called redemption. And that's what we saw with the rise of Donald Trump and the rise of the Tea Party. And thank God, Donald Trump was denied a second term because we meaning Black people, women, gay people, trans people, our rights would have been trounced. You know, we never finished our discussion about those 5 ministers. You know, so let me wrap that up.
Okay.
The Lincoln, as you said the crucial thing, the North was being defeated. So when the newspapers printed the fact that Lincoln had met with these 5 Black ministers at the White House and to encourage them to lead the free community, you know, out of here to emigrate to Africa or to Latin America or the Caribbean. And Douglas and all the other Black abolitionists go crazy. Lincoln then releases the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September of 1862. And he still mentions colonization in his message to Congress. That's what I was reading from Eric Foner in December of 1862. But when the emancipation is in its final form, there's no mention of colonization. And he has added that Black men will have the right to bear arms and fight for the Union. And Lincoln himself says that without he calls them in a letter in 1864, he calls them his Black warriors. Without his Black warriors, the North would not have won. And in the last speech that he gives, he says that he has decided, he's become convinced that certain Black men, not all Black men, certain Black men should have the right to vote. He said his 200,000 Black, he didn't mention the figure, but we know there were 200,000 Black men who fought in the Union and in the Navy, the Army and the Navy together. He said, my Black warriors, in effect, and the very intelligent Negroes. You know, he's thinking of Frederick Douglass. We don't know how many very intelligent Negroes there were. And you can truthfully say that that speech led to his death because John Wilkes Booth was on the grounds of the White House listening to Lincoln. When Lincoln said that, he turned to a man next to him and said, "That's it, I'm going to run him through," meaning I'm going to kill him. And he assassinated Abraham Lincoln because Lincoln underwent a major transformation about the mental capacity of Black people, their fitness to be citizen, and their right to bear arms and fight for the Union, and in part through his friendship, as my colleague John Stauffer and as David Blight, my good friend.
Frederick Douglass.
Yeah, who wrote.
Yeah.
David Blight knows more about Frederick Douglass than Frederick Douglass did.
I had a conversation with him like this 2 years ago.
Oh, he's great. And we optioned the documentary rights to David's book. And I just looked at the rough cut for our documentary, which will be aired on HBO next year, I think. So fingers crossed.
Nice.
So
I got one final question, Skip.
Okay.
How can we implement the Black Church, the book, The Black Church, into a K-12 curriculum?
Well, Jim and I have talked about this. This was a prelude. Jim Basker, my dear friend, who needs no introduction to this audience, has asked me to work with him on the Reconstruction curriculum and a curriculum about the Black Church. And you know, Jim is a hard man to say, a hard person to say no to.
No to.
And Phil, I'd like your input about that, because what I did, I want to give a shout out to my editor at Penguin Random House, Scott Moyers, who's in the audience. What I did was found a way to tell the sweep of Black history through the mechanism of the evolution of the Black church.
Right.
So it's like turning a telescope around, right? So instead of fitting the church into a history of African Americans like John Hope Franklin and Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham's From Slavery to Freedom, I turn the telescope around and tell history of Black people through the history of the church, through the evolution of the denominations. Oh, remember I was going to tell you about the triangular structure using Richard Harvey Kane?
Yes.
Okay, so Richard Harvey Kane, I've already talked about. He was born in 1825. He was born free in what is now West Virginia, in Greenbrier County, Virginia. But Daniel Payne was born in 1811 in Charleston. He was born free. He was a mulatto, member of the Brown Society, because you were not too dark, you weren't Black, you were brown.
Right.
And he becomes bishop of the AME Church in 1852. And I got to tell you this story. He believed that, you know, Black people should sit in straight lines, erect, and and sing the hymns. And none of this gospel music, none of this getting the Holy Ghost, none of that. And so he, after the Civil War, he goes down to Charleston, Mother Emanuel, and he's proselytizing throughout the South and for the AME Church. And he goes to a traditional Black church, and people are getting the Holy Ghost, and they're doing the ring shout. And he jumps out of the pulpit, Phil, and he goes, stop, you're worshiping the devil, you're worshiping the devil. You got to stop that. None of that African stuff. And so I love that story. And then Henry McNeil Turner is born free in Washington, D.C. Slavery is legal in Washington, D.C. until 1862 during the Civil War. And he's born in 1834. He's a chaplain, one of the few Black chaplains for the Union Army during the Civil War. And he becomes bishop of the AME Church in 1880. He goes to Sierra Leone, Liberia, and South Africa to proselytize for the AME Church in the 1880s, 1890s. And he comes back, and at the founding meeting of the National Baptist Convention in 1895, he gives a speech, Phil, and he says, God was a Negro.
Black. Right.
God was Black. And people couldn't believe it. I mean, that was amazing. I mean, when I read that, I went, wow, that was in 1895. And the National Baptist Convention was complicated. One of my favorite stories is about Reverend Boyd. And Reverend Boyd in 1896 forms the National Baptist Publishing Company. In 1904, the Citizen Savings Bank as part of the denomination. And Phil, in 1908, the Negro Doll Company. And they were all under the National Baptist Convention. Isn't that amazing?
That is amazing. That is amazing.
And that shows the centrality of the institution of the Black church just through one denomination alone.
Skip, I hate to do this. They're asking me to wrap things up.
We just getting started.
I know. I got another hour or so or more in me. But thank you, brother. Thank you for the book. Thank you for all the work you do. Thank you for everything you've taught, everything you have modeled. You are you are just a light in the Black community, and just could not thank you enough. I want to thank all of our guests for attending and being on with us today. Please go buy the book. Don't just buy the book. Buy the book. Read the book. Okay, read the book. A recording of this conversation will be available on the Gilder Lehrman website. Please check that out. Go to gilderlehrman.org for more GLI resources. And again, thank you all for attending, and God bless you.
God bless you. Thank you, my brother.
Okay.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.